Hello everybody, my name is Michael Sorokan Armstrong and I am a researcher in the Computational Data Science Lab at the University of Granada. And today I'm recording a presentation I originally delivered for students of the SSC IMPROVE program who work with a variety of different data types from a variety of different fields as part of their graduate projects. And today I'm going to be talking about methods for dimensionality reduction, in particular nonlinear method, a very popular nonlinear method called uniform manifold approximation and projection. So in short, any type of dimensionality reduction method is used when you want to do some sort of exploratory data analysis and look for patterns in your data that are harder to visualize in multiple dimensions, anything above 3 really. And you want a sort of faithful representation of that data in 2 or 3 dimensions in a way that preserves its characteristics and allows you to spot patterns that you wouldn't otherwise be able to see. So the most common classical method for this is principal component analysis, and that's a linear method, but a sort of up-and-coming new fun method that's been around since 2018 is this UMAP, and that's a nonlinear technique. So throughout this presentation, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be discussing the relative benefits and drawbacks to using a very powerful technique such as UMAP over a simpler technique such as principal component analysis or really any other linear method. So my qualifications for this is that many years ago when I was trying to promote some of my research on Twitter, what I was doing was I was comparing linear dimensionality reduction techniques, not only PCA, but independent component analysis and projection pursuit analysis. And I was doing this on the digits dataset. And the digit dataset is a series of handwritten digits recorded over a variety of different pixels in sort of this rectangular space. And the pixels which record a signal or the presence or absence of ink there's no one pixel that's necessarily correlated more with 8 or 1 or any of these other digits. In fact, the sort of relative position of the pixels relative to the other data matters a lot. And so it's difficult to sort of represent the class membership of each of these different digits using linear dimensionality reduction techniques. In fact, UMAP does this much more efficiently, and when I tried to just train a support vector machine model on just the 2 reduced dimensions, it was clear that based off of the external prediction accuracy on the external set, that neither PCA nor ICA nor projection pursuit analysis was really good at capturing the most significant variance in the data that was relevant to discriminating between the different classes. Now, UMAP was able to do this much more efficiently, and even just using this very simple model, a radial basis function support vector machine model, trained and tested on just 2 dimensions, in this case the UMAP embeddings or the PCA independent component analysis or projection pursuit analysis embeddings, it's very clear that the UMAP encapsulates the most relevant variation in the data more efficiently and can create a fairly good model without too much hassle. And 2 of my colleagues from the University of Alberta were very nice enough to like this tweet, and the original author of the UMAP paper from 2018 was also nice enough to like this tweet, for a total of 3 likes on this tweet and 1 repost, which was made by a bot. So just taking this as my qualifications as a minor internet celebrity, I'm going to be moving forward and talking about UMAP today. So I think when we're talking about any sort of like machine learning or exploratory data analysis technique, I think it's really important to sort of keep in mind what its mathematical heritage is, because all we're doing really is applied mathematics. And with principal component analysis, it's based off of very familiar techniques and principles from linear algebra. So you can think of principal component analysis as basically just an eigendecomposition that's looking for orthogonal axes of most significant variance in your data. UMAP is a nonlinear dimensionality reduction technique, so it doesn't have the sort of same convenient operations that are available to us in linear algebra. In fact, UMAP is based primarily on topology, the mathematical study of topology. And just generally speaking, topology in mathematics is concerned with the properties of structures that are consistent under continuous deformations. And in this very famous example, and any continuous deformation is something where you can pull and stretch it however you want, but you can't tear it and it can't pass through itself. That's a very, very simple overview of topology. But as you can see in this famous example, there's the donut to coffee cup transformation where just by stretching the coffee cup, it can become a donut and vice versa. Same thing with the cow. Now the cow would be a donut if it had a sort of tube that connected its mouth to its butthole. But assuming this cow doesn't have any of these things, we can see how we can take this cow and we can deform it into a sphere without tearing it or having the material that represents the cow pass through itself. So in this case, what UMAP is trying to do is it's trying to represent topological structures in high dimensions with a high degree of fidelity for lower dimensions that we can actually see. So these sort of projections to these lower dimensions that we see should be representative of the sort of topological structure of the data in higher dimensions, which we can't see. So how is this different? So consider we're going to be comparing principal component analysis with UMAP a lot throughout this course. And I just want to consider what constitutes a linear operator before we get into a nonlinear operator. So in principal component analysis, let's consider our principal component model F, and it's operating on two vectors U and V. And the principal component model can be thought of basically just a change of basis from the original coordinates to coordinates that best describe the axes of most significant variance in the data. So to this effect, a linear operator needs to preserve additivity and multiplicity. So all additivity is saying is that f of u plus f of v is equal to f of u plus v. So before and after the linear transformation, the additive characteristics of the data are preserved. In a similar way, any constant c multiplied by the linear operator on a vector u is the same as that constant c multiplied by the original vector and then operated upon by our linear operator. So let's consider a nonlinear case, right? So we have equidistantly spaced points, and there's a relationship within this data. The data that is closer to each other in one dimension is going to be a similar color as it moves from blue to yellow. Now, to effect an intuition about what additivity and multiplicity means relative to something that does not preserve additivity nor multiplicity, I distorted the points on the left to get the chart on the right. And this is just in one dimension, but consider that there's no single number that I can add or multiply these points by to sort of get this nonlinear distortion as we see on the plot on the right. And similarly, I can't recover the original points in the equidistant space, in the equidistantly spaced case, by multiplying the points on the right or adding anything to the points on the right. So in this case, between the plot on the left and the plot on the right, neither additivity nor multiplicity is preserved after they're affected by this sort of unknown nonlinear operator. So in this case, the unknown nonlinear operator was just like a sinusoidal function that periodically modified the position of the points as a function of x, right? So when we're considering a nonlinear dimensionality reduction technique, really what it's trying to do is it's trying to find the characteristics of this nonlinear operation, and it's trying to recover basically the equidistantly spaced points as they project to this sort of unknown nonlinear function. And this unknown nonlinear function we're going to call the manifold. Now, it's really important to consider because UMAP is based off of topological data analysis that the topology of these two vectors is the same because the points don't ever the order of the points is preserved. That is the object doesn't cross over itself in one dimension. So the point on the left is the same, the plot on the right and the plot on the left is topologically the same. And we're looking for some method that can represent that. But of course, this is operating in many, many more dimensions than just one. So it's clear to see what's going on in one dimension, but it won't be so easy to see what's going on in multiple dimensions. So nonlinear dimensionality reduction is often called manifold learning because these nonlinear functions that we're representing our data upon, that we're mapping to, are often called manifolds. So just consider this sort of squiggly S shape with some randomness associated with it, right? And the blue line is the line of best fits, as calculated by principal component analysis. This is the axis of most significant variance, and it doesn't explain it very well. Not only does it not explain the variance very well, but you're not going to be able to see that sort of hidden structure. You could, if you use two principal components, definitely, because this data is only present in 2 dimensions. But you're no longer reducing the dimensionality of the data when you're going from 2 dimensions to 1 dimension. Now, a manifold learning technique, I think this is self-organizing maps in this case. A manifold learning technique is trying to calculate this non-linear function that the gray points can project to and represent them more efficiently as a dimensionality reduction technique. So the manifold learning technique accounts for a greater percentage of the total variance in the data using only one dimension, as opposed to the principal component, which also uses 1 dimension but doesn't describe nearly as much variance in the data. And so just consider 2 things when we're talking about manifold learning. The first one is, how is this manifold calculated? And then the second thing is, how are the data represented on the manifold? These 2 questions actually relate to the 2 main steps of UMAP. And UMAP, in a sense, is actually conceptually a lot easier to understand than principal component analysis, because it's proceeding through a series of steps and treatments of the data to, wind up with your final representation. Principal component analysis, I mean, like, yes, there's loops going on in the algorithm as it calculates it, but I mean, really, mathematically, it's just one step, and that step is singular value decomposition, which is related to eigen decomposition, right? So you're calculating the eigenvectors of your matrix, which sort of happens all at once. And if you don't understand eigen decomposition, it's really difficult to understand principal component analysis. But in the case of UMAP, there is very complicated mathematics involved, but it's sort of like step by step, and it's a sort of easier algorithm to understand in that sense. It might not be easy to understand like where the algorithm is coming from, like it's based off the mathematical principles of topology. And if you really want to understand UMAP, you have to understand topology. But just for the average layperson, in terms of getting an understanding for basically what UMAP is doing, that's not strictly speaking necessary. So let's build another intuition. More intuition, I think, is always good. So let's consider a classic case of a 2-manifold where we can represent the globe as a 2-manifold. So we can represent all of the data by projecting to this sort of like Euclidean space, right, which is represented by the circle here. So in this Euclidean space, it represents the sort of local structure of the data, but it doesn't really represent the global structure of the data. And this is something we're going to talk a lot about when we're talking about UMAP. So I'm from Canada, and sort of like if this sort of view of the globe is sort of centered around more or less Canada. So if I'm walking 10 kilometers in Canada in this sort of like Euclidean space, this flat Euclidean space, if I'm walking a certain distance within Canada, that is fairly representative of sort of like 10 kilometers within Canada. But if I'm walking 10 kilometers sort of on the edges of this sort of Euclidean space, this circle, pardon me, and I'm doing it sort of closer to Africa, then this 10 kilometers that I'm walking on this circle does not necessarily represent very well 10 kilometers that I'm walking in Africa. I'm obviously going to be walking a much, much larger distance in Africa than I would be in Canada, according to a similar distance in this Euclidean representation of the manifold. So again, local structure versus global structure. Just because the local structure is preserved doesn't mean the global structure is preserved. So when we're looking at the UMAP projections, they are projections to sort of this Euclidean space, and the points that are close to each other, their sort of distance to each other is sort of represented very well, but the distance between points that are far away isn't represented as well. And there's all kinds of implications for that related back to topology. 2 things can have different shapes, but be topologically identical. And the UMAP representation will vary and reflect that. So there's lots and lots of other types of manifold learning techniques. There's isomap embedding, there's multidimensional scaling, and there's t-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding, otherwise known as t-SNE. And this is just from like scikit-learn, just very basic examples of different manifold learning techniques. What they did here is they've taken this S curve in 3 dimensions, so it's just an S along 3 dimensions with some randomness associated with it, right? And what we can kind of see the structure really, really clearly in 3 dimensions, and we're interested in sort of like how did the different manifold learning techniques kind of unfold this S structure in a way that it's represented in 2 dimensions, right? So with isomap embedding, it unfolds it based off the sort of geodesic distances, the sort of drawing a path between each of the points, and then based off that information, it's sort of unfolding that into 2 dimensions. So you can kind of see how the points move from yellow to purple as they would in the original data. But you don't really see the fact that it's an S. With multidimensional scaling, there's a sort of constraint on the data, right? That the um, distance from each point to each other point is preserved in the lower dimensional representation as it is in the higher dimensional representation. T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding, t-SNE, also unfolds it, and it gets us this kind of U shape. But what's sort of interesting is that as it unfolds it, right, there's this sort of consistent density in the data, right, that isn't necessarily present with the isomap embedding. You can kind of see there's a lot of holes. But t-SNE appears to sort of really, really represent the fact that these points are randomly distributed, and the lower dimensional representation is sort of that of a relatively kind of consistent sheet, if you would. Now, comparing that with UMAP, UMAP has a lot more flexibility. You can modify the parameters, and it makes some algorithmic approximations and improvements upon t-SNE to perform the calculations much, much quicker. However, with that, you can see that UMAP can kind of tend to fit to patterns in the data that aren't real if you're not very, very careful with the parameters. So we know just from how this original S curve was calculated that it's an S with some degree of randomness associated with it. The only structure we're interested in is the S. But UMAP, there's these sort of tendrils that it's fitting to that don't necessarily represent the global structure of the data very well. And if you're not careful, you might say, oh, there's this clustering in the data. Well, there's not really, because it's randomly, uniformly distributed, and all of the other dimensionality reduction techniques kind of reflect that. But UMAP, because you can control more things in UMAP, it doesn't reflect that as well. And you have to kind of go through the different parameters, and you have to modify them, and you have to be very, very careful with them in order to make sure that these patterns you're seeing are consistent. So I can't talk too much about UMAP without sort of the gold standard for educational content available on YouTube. So StatQuest by Joshua Starmer has done a really great video series on UMAP covering not only the basic ideas about UMAP, but also the more mathematically oriented details. So whenever I'm reading the UMAP paper, I'm always going back and checking with these StatQuest videos to make sure that my intuition is correct. And I really, really, really encourage anyone watching this video to check out these 2 videos on UMAP for even more in-depth explanations about how the mathematics work. In some point in this video, I'm going to borrow some of the calculations from the mathematical details clearly explained video because it saved me some time and allows me to focus more on the application of UMAP. And I'm crediting Joshua Starmer for that. He did an incredible job with these 2 videos, and I really, really encourage you to check them out. So he's gone through sort of a bottom-up approach with at least the mathematical details, and I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm doing sort of a top-down approach. So I'm covering the 2 basic steps, and in those basic steps, I'm sort of going over the more detailed steps for each of those 2 steps, right? So rather than just doing it sequentially, I'm sort of looking at the 2 main steps, looking at the first main step, and then moving to the second main step, and taking apart each step individually. But if you want the more sequential version of the story, please check out these videos. They're really, really good. Okay, so here we are, UMAP in 2 steps. The first step is we're going to represent the topology of the data as a graph structure. So a graph structure where each of our different data points are nodes, and the distance of each of these nodes to other data points are represented by vertices, right? And we're going to create this graph in a way such that it underlines really well the topological structure of the data in higher dimensions. And once we get that representation, our next step is to represent this graph as a lower dimensional representation. So again, how is the manifold calculated? And then how is the data projected to the manifold? The graph is how the manifold is calculated, and how the points are projected as they relate to this graph is the second step. It's the second question for how UMAP operates. So at this point, I am going to take some calculations from Joshua Starmer because he's done a great job, and I encourage you to check out his videos. So there are two main parameters in UMAP. The first one is the number of nearest neighbors, and the second one is the minimum distance. The number of nearest neighbors has the most important implications for the graph structure of the data because the number of nearest neighbors determines the relationship of the local structure as far as each point is concerned. So if we have a number of nearest neighbors of 3, including the point itself, I'm going to be primarily concerned with the local structure as it relates to 2 other points surrounding this one point. So let's consider point C. For a number of nearest neighbors 3, C has 2 other points it needs to connect to, B and A. B is going to be its nearest neighbor, so we're going to scale the results to 1, where 1 is the closest neighbor. And then the next closest neighbor will have a value less than 1. And so for all of A, B, and C, we're going to calculate the distance between each of those points in hyperdimensional space. So this is just in 2 dimensions, but keep in mind this is happening for many, many, many dimensions. So the nearest neighbor of C is B, so that's scaled to 1. And the next nearest neighbor of C is A, so that's scaled to 0.6. And we do that for all of the points. And for some of it, it's consistent. So the nearest neighbor of B and C is each other. And so both of those points are scaled to 1. However, the nearest neighbor of C to A is 0.6 because A is not C's nearest neighbor. But let's say C is A's nearest neighbor. So we have this sort of inconsistency in our graph representation, right? C is A's nearest neighbor, but not vice versa. So we have to reconcile that, or else this graph representation is going to become very, very complicated. And we do that using a fuzzy union operator, which basically handles the multiple class membership of each of these different vertices, right? And it is somewhat counterintuitive because now it looks like C has 2 nearest neighbors, but just bear with me. And this is derived from fuzzy logic operations, and it works. So this is from the UMAP, the UMAP instruction manual, basically, and you have this sort of sinusoidal representation of the data. And just to give you a further intuition for the fact that the scaled weights of each point relative to its nearest neighbors are not necessarily consistent, let's consider the orange point circled in orange and this other point circled in blue. So you can see that the orange point has 2 nearest neighbors. Let me just turn my laser pointer on. This is its nearest neighbor, and this is its second nearest neighbor, right? But this blue point has 2 other nearest neighbors, and they're different. And these sort of bendy lines are representing the sort of inconsistency of each point's nearest neighbor. However, after the fuzzy union operator, you can see that these points now, even if they're not as intuitive, they are consistent for each of the points, right? There's no more sort of like hypocrisy almost, right? Well, like these 2 are my nearest neighbors, but these 2 are their nearest neighbors, for instance. So now that all the weights are compatible, we've sort of created our graph reconstruction of the data. And now that we've created our graph reconstruction of the data, we have to represent this graph in lower dimensional space. So in this case, the original sinusoidal wave was in 2 dimensions, and we have to represent it in 1 dimension. And we are going to just represent it in 1 dimension for the sake of ease of interpretation, but keep in mind if you are doing this in 2 dimensions, you're going to be doing the same thing, but in 2 dimensions. So this is the cost function. Sorry, my face is blocking the symbol on the left-hand side of the equation, but you get the main idea, right? So we're going to pick. We have to do this stochastically. So we're going to pick a random point, and for this random point, we're going to pick one neighbor, and we're going to pick another point that's not a neighbor. And what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and minimize this cost function by sort of randomly initializing it in the sort of lower dimensional representation, and we're going to move this point closer to its neighbor and further away from a point that's not its neighbor. And we're going to do this stochastically for all of the points, just randomly iterate through all the points, calculate a new lower dimensional representation, and keep doing that until we reach some convergence. So we're minimizing this sort of cost function, right? We're trying to sort of maximize the distance between, normalized between 0 and 1, such that the highest distance, the highest possible distance is going to be 1. Log of 1 is equal to 0, and that would minimize the cost function for the sort of leftmost term. Then, similarly, we're trying to go 1 minus the distance to its neighbor. So if the distance to its neighbor is 0, 1 minus 0 is 1, log of 1 is 0, and we minimize the rightmost term on this cost function. So a question you might be asking is like, why not move it directly onto the neighbor? Well, you notice that this particular cost function doesn't have any information about the graph structure of the data, for instance, but this cost function, the more comprehensive cost function, does incorporate information about the graph structure of the data. So W of L is the sort of weights of the vertices or the distances between the points in the lower dimensional space, and W of H is their sort of corresponding distances in the graph structure, right? So like, yes, if we move it closer and closer together, you know, in the lower cost function, then we're minimizing that cost. But that cost is then scaled by information encoded by the weights of the graph in higher dimensions, W of H. So for all of these sort of distances, we're iterating through them to calculate the lower dimensional representation of all of the points stochastically. So what have we done? Well, in the first step, what we've done is we've sort of constructed a weighted k neighbor graph, and we've harmonized the results for, you know, differing distances and the fact that, you know, your local clusters are going to be different from each other from the perspective of each of the points. And then once we've done that, we've created a objective function that we've minimized to sort of represent this graph in lower dimensional space. So now let's sort of get into more of the philosophy. Like when do we want to use UMAP? What are its benefits? What are its drawbacks? So yes, UMAP preserves local structure very, very well, but it doesn't guarantee global structure, and we'll find out more about that in a bit. It's a lot faster than t-SNE, but it is slower than linear methods. You can visualize high-dimensional structures, but it is difficult to interpret why those structures arise. Because with the linear methods, you have something called your loadings, which are the sort of linear combination of each variable as they contribute to the projection within the new space that you've calculated. But you have to calculate the inverse of each point within the lower dimensional representation individually to sort of figure out what the contributions of those original variables are to that one particular point in space. And that's very computationally expensive to do, and you might be disappointed with the results, as we'll see a bit later. Now, UMAP can be applied to a variety of different problems. You can use UMAP to align your data, but it doesn't have those sort of convenient mathematical relationships, right? Because remember, principal component analysis is just one step. It's one mathematical identity via the singular value decomposition. So if I'm working on a mathematical problem, sometimes I can kind of just insert principal component analysis to simplify the problem. And I can perform linear operations on any one aspect of either the loadings or the scores in principal component analysis space. And they have useful properties that allow me to solve more complicated mathematical problems. UMAP is more of an algorithmic. It's mathematical, there's a lot of math involved, but it's algorithmic in how it handles the data. And there's no sort of unique solution to UMAP that I can rely on when I'm solving a more complicated mathematical problem. And so UMAP is flexible, but there's also many metaparameters involved in it. There's the two main ones, but there's also other ones you can consider as well. And all of these will have very, very important effects on the representation of the data. So sometimes it's good if your model isn't flexible. If your model is calculating one thing and one thing only, sometimes that has nice properties for your analysis. But if your data itself doesn't necessarily play by the rules, if it's, you know, if it's not linear, for instance, then a linear method might not be the best way of representing the data. So just something to consider when we're moving on here. Okay, so without further ado, this is a sort of classic demonstration of UMAP. Basically, what they did is they've taken a woolly mammoth skeleton and they've scanned it. So, there's a whole bunch of points in three-dimensional space. And what we're going to do is we're going to try and squish this three-dimensional woolly mammoth into two dimensions. And since, we don't really see a lot of woolly mammoths walking around because they're extinct, but they kind of look like an elephant. They're bigger than an elephant, but we kind of have an intuition for what a woolly mammoth should look like, right? So it's a useful exercise. Like, how does the reduction in dimension preserve what we know to be true about a woolly mammoth? If we modify the metaparameters too much, we're going to get nonsensical results. But if we modify them within a certain range, we get consistent results. And when we're building a UMAP model, we want our results to be sort of consistent through a range of metaparameters. If you modify the minimum distance, for instance, from zero point 0.1 to 0.11, if the results change completely and your interpretation changes completely, that's not a very good UMAP model, right? You know, it should be robust against minor changes in the metaparameters, right? And we're going to find out how to confirm that in this example, actually. So just right here, we're going to look at the Mammoth data set to begin with. And the credits for the Mammoth data set are found in this GitHub repository, which will be linked in the description. So something to note is actually in this GitHub repository, there are the requirements that you'll need in order to run this Jupyter notebook. And we're going to be loading some familiar libraries. The UMAP library, something to note here is that in the requirements, um, UMAP is under umap-learn if you're installing it through pip. So let's just go back to the Mammoth dataset. This is our sort of original analysis of the Mammoth data. It's just going to load a bit. And this is the last round of analyses that was performed on this dataset, and it's recorded as part of the Jupyter notebook. So this data set, we're going to use pandas to read the CSV file, 3 dimensions, and we're going to sample randomly about 50,000, well, exactly 50,000 data points. And just using matplotlib, we're going to plot what the mammoth looks like. And that's what it looks like. Hopefully that's pretty familiar to you. Kind of like an elephant, but bigger and scarier and extinct. Okay, and we're going to start with building our UMAP model. So first, it's sort of using the scikit-learn API, something similar to that. We're going to call something our reducer, and we're going to call it from UMAP. We're going to specify the number of components. It's going to be 2. The number of nearest neighbors, again, so what we were talking about during the presentation, and the minimum distance, which is between 0 and 1. So a smaller minimum distance will allow the points to cluster closer together in the lower dimensional representation, and a higher minimum distance will will stop them from clustering so tightly, and they'll be more sort of diffuse. The metric is another important thing that we have to keep in mind, and so in this case, we are calculating the distance matrix based on Euclidean distances. And that might not always be the best metric to use, but certainly the mammoth exists in Euclidean space in 3 dimensions, and so we have a pretty good intuition for why we're using the Euclidean distance metric in this case. And verbose just sort of allows you to walk through what the UMAP algorithm is doing, right? So we're constructing our fuzzy simplicial set, finding the nearest neighbors, um, and yeah, that's the first step. We're doing the graphical representation, and then you can see using stochastic gradient descent is finding a lower dimensional representation of the data through a series of epochs. And yeah, moving on, here is our lower dimensional representation of the mammoth. And so if you're following along, I would encourage you to sort of play with the different parameters, see how that affects your results. Fix the random state, don't fix the random state. And there's no axes labeled here because really all we're trying to do at this point is just build an intuition for how UMAP works, right? So we have what we know is a mammoth skeleton, and you can kind of see the rib cages here, the tusks, the head, the arms, the legs, even a bit of the tail here. And you can see it's not an amazing representation of the elephant, right? you can see that, yeah, you have these sort of local structures that correspond with like the toes, I guess, of the mammoth, and you can kind of see the shape of one of its limbs, but this is so much bigger than that one, and the tail is just this kind of really, really small thing over here. The ribs are kind of flattened in a way that's kind of weird. And this gets back to what we were sort of talking about earlier. It preserves the local structure, so it preserves the characteristics of the limbs, but how these local structures relate to each other in a lower dimensional representation isn't immediately obvious. Well, it is obvious, but it's not consistent, right? So the distance I'm walking along these limbs here is not going to be the same as the distance I'm walking along these limbs here. And that's just an inherent limitation of UMAP, and you have to work a little bit to make sure that the representation, because it does not preserve the global structure in the same way like a linear operation would, you have to make sure that what you're seeing is really legitimate. Because just another thing to point out, if there's any discontinuities in the data, like if the ribs are kind of broken or whatever, then they may appear as separate, even though in reality they would probably be connected to the rest of the woolly mammoth. So you can see a lot of sort of separations that may or may not be like, meaningful. And if you were to perform clustering analysis on this data, that would be something you'd have to keep in mind. Okay, so we're going to move on to sort of the Procrustes analysis of the mammoth dataset. So what I'm going to highlight first of all is we have more or less the same packages, but from the scikit-learn linear algebra module, we're importing the orthogonal Procrustes function. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the same mammoth dataset, our CSV file in 3 dimensions, and we're going to bootstrap it twice, right? So it's selecting 50 random samples, so 50 random points for both the Mammoth 1 dataset and the Mammoth 2 dataset. So it's possible that some of these points will be the same, but a lot of these points are going to be different because they're randomly sampled. It's not really important in this case to have a perfectly sort of exclusive representation of the data, right? It's okay if some of the points are the same, and it's okay if some of them are different, because really we're just looking at the sort of functionality of the UMAP algorithm and how it treats different data highlighting the same underlying structure, which we know to be the woolly mammoth in this case. So we're going to start off by plotting both of the mammoths, and you can see, yeah, they're more or less the same. The globs, or the sort of points, are a little bit too big for you to see the finer detail, but what's important here is just for us to understand that although the points are different, they represent the same underlying structure. And we are going to build 2 different UMAP models in this case. We're going to do reducer 1 and reducer 2. In reducer 1, the minimum distance is going to be relatively low and the number of nearest neighbors is going to be high. And in reducer 2, we're just changing the number of nearest neighbors, okay? And we're going to fit to the 2 different data sets with these 2 different UMAP models. And we're just working through it. Verbose is on. And yeah, you can see some very clear differences in the representation of the same data, right? So in the plot on the left, we have a higher number of nearest neighbors, and on the plot on the right, we have a lower number of nearest neighbors. And you can see that on the plot on the left, actually, the sort of global structure is preserved a little bit better. The shape of the limbs is more consistent within each limb, but on the plot on the right, you can see that the limbs, even though the sort of stance of the mammoth, these limbs should be similar, they're actually quite different from each other. And yeah, that's just something you can take a look at. You can even see sort of the hip bone of the mammoth here pretty clearly, but what constitutes the hip bone, what constitutes the tail is not clear on the plot on the right. So this is just a really basic example of how the number of nearest neighbors affects the representation of your data. Again, the higher your number of nearest neighbors, generally speaking, as a general rule of thumb, you're going to preserve more of the global structure, because now the local structure, what's considered to be the local structure, constitutes a higher percentage of your data. But I encourage you to go to this Jupyter notebook and kind of fiddle with the settings and see how it affects it in a way that's intuitive for you to understand. Okay, now let's see if we can do a Procrustes analysis on these two disparate data sets. And I've shown you a Procrustes analysis in the lecture slides that works pretty well. And I'm going to give you a hint if you want to sort of get good results from this. You should increase the number of nearest neighbors and you should increase the minimum distance in your UMAP models. And if you do that, you should get sort of these two embeddings that line up on each other very easily. But when we try and find best sort of linear fit as A relates to B, we're trying to fit our reducer 1 to our reducer 2, you can see that it's not really a good fit at all, right? Like there's no linear combination, there's no reflection, there's no rotation in this data that can map the reducer 1 to the reducer 2. And that's just something very interesting to consider because it should be the same data, but it's represented very differently in a way that's not really clear to us. So this is confusing the Procrustes analysis, and this is mathematically the best possible fit as far as the points in the black are related to the points in the blue, but even the best possible fit doesn't necessarily tell us that it's representing the data equivalently. And that should be fairly obvious because the parameters are very different. But for sort of smaller changes in parameters that are not quite as obvious, you should be able to map one onto the other with some reliability, right? So for small changes in the parameters, we don't expect the results to change very much, and I encourage you to fix the random state, even though it will take a bit longer to sort of get these results from your data. But in the lecture slides, we'll show an example of something that an example that works very well where we are able to project one onto the other. But this is just sort of a demonstration of how it doesn't work. Okay, so hopefully, you got something similar to this, right? So we're taking the three-dimensional woolly mammoth data and we're projecting it into two dimensions. And you can see that if we just do bootstrap sampling from the woolly mammoth data, some of the points are going to be similar, some of the points are not going to be similar, but ultimately it's representing the same woolly mammoth, just at different points, right? So we perform one UMAP model and the second UMAP model, and we can see that our results are fairly consistent, right? We get the same basic shape of the UMAP when we do this Procrustes analysis. And the Procrustes analysis is assuming that these two-dimensional UMAP embeddings are in Euclidean space, and it sort of tries to find the best fit of, the blue onto the black. And so you can fix the random state to make sure that your results are consistent as possible, and that does slow it down a bit because it affects the parallelization of the calculations. But if you fix the random state and you get sort of similar results all of the time, you can see that yes, your UMAP model is sort of consistently representing the data in the same way. And if you can compare these two models through a Procrustes analysis like they did in the UMAP paper, even better. In this case, you may or may have not seen it in your data because it depends on what things are sampled, it depends on the random state of the UMAP, and of course the metaparameters, because you won't always see this really, really nice agreement. But you can see that yes, the global structure is preserved, but if you look at the leg is it's chiral, right? It's not the same between the two different models, right? But in real life it would be. The relationship between the leg and the rest of the body is fixed, but in the UMAP projection, that relationship is not fixed because we're looking at the topology. And in this case, it's topologically identical to have the leg bent this way, one way in the lower dimensional representation, as it is bent the other way in the lower dimensional representation. So even though these sort of legs are mirrored, topologically, UMAP doesn't care, right? So that's just something to consider. Okay, so again, just getting back to our sort of original example with the embeddings of the S shape, just to drive this point home, if you modify if the number of nearest neighbors are too small, you will favor the sort of local structure of the data over the global structure of the data. And this is something that TSNE does a little bit better than UMAP in some cases. So in this case we know what it's supposed to look like. It should just be unfolded as a sheet with sort of a consistent density of points. But UMAP just through some random fluctuations in the data, UMAP is picking up these finer points that you may not be interested in. So that's just something always to keep in mind when you're building your UMAP models. Your UMAP models should be fairly consistent across a range of meta parameters. It should be robust against small changes in meta parameters. And if you're not sure, just build two UMAP models and see how they project to each other in how the embeddings project to each other. If they project well, great. If they don't, that's a problem. And so that's and of course you can also animate it like some people do. It's like, oh, here's my UMAP model as I change the number of nearest neighbors. Now it's tricky because like your UMAP model won't always have the same coordinates, right? So you kind of have to you do have to sort of try and fit them onto each other after building them, because it won't converge to exactly the same solution every time because of that sort of stochastic characteristic of how the cost function is minimized, right? So it might converge to a different local minimum in one case than it does the other case. If you fix the random state, this shouldn't be as big of a deal, but still, if you change the metaparameters, even with the same random state, it might converge to something that is similar, but the embeddings themselves will be different, and you might have to do that sort of Procrusteus analysis to check. Okay, so as promised, we're going to do some comparisons with principal component analysis. And this is the digits data set I was telling you about a little bit earlier, right? So we get a whole bunch of digits, and this is sort of what the data looks like. So for each observation, right, this sort of two-dimensional representation is unfolded, right? So each pixel is one variable. If we do two principal components on this unfolded data, and then we refold it again, we refold the residuals being the difference between the principal component model and the original data, we see that there's this residual structure in the data, right? We can see that the 3, let me get my laser pointer, the 3 still kind of looks like a 3 in the residuals. It barely looks like a 3 because of the low resolution, but you can kind of see this sort of similarity between 3 here and the 3 in the residuals, and it's the same for the 8, right? So when you're using a linear model, something that you're able to do is you're always able to look at the residuals, and that's probably one of the most important steps in evaluating your linear model, is seeing what is accounted for by the linear model and what is not accounted for by the linear model. So when we're assessing if our model is linear or not, it's not just a question of like looking at like how the data projects into the linear subspaces. It's a question of like looking at the residuals. What's the difference between this representation of the data and the original data? Is it a good representation? Am I still seeing stuff I would expect to see in the model in the residuals? And if I'm seeing it in the residuals, then my model is not really explaining a lot of the data. So this is only two principal components. You could do it with like 5 or 6 principal components, but again, 5 or 6 principal components are very, very difficult, much more difficult to interpret than 2. So if you can do the same thing, if you sort of have an intuition for the fact that your data is nonlinear, like the mammoth it's not a box, it's not linear. It is represented in 3 dimensions, but it's not efficiently represented. It's not going to be efficiently represented using a linear technique, because the characteristics of the mammoth that we were looking for are themselves not linear characteristics. The mammoth is curvy. It has ribs, it has tusks, it has all of these things. And if we just build a 2 principal component model, we would sort of expect to see a lot of that structure not encapsulated by the linear model in 2 dimensions, right? But it's the same thing that's happening here, right? We see aspects of the 3 in the residuals that we don't see in the model necessarily. And so, yes, you can also follow this very famous example of comparing the linear techniques with the nonlinear techniques, such as UMAP, right? So there's principal component analysis, which looks for orthogonal axes of variance, but these orthogonal axes might not necessarily be the most interesting axes. If you're optimizing by a different category, different criteria, in this case like statistical independence, you might be able to get better results. So in this case right here, right, this is sort of an illustration of axes of greatest variance, principal components. This is a better illustration of how independent component analysis works, just sort of intuitively without getting too much into the math. Projection pursuit analysis is a very advanced linear dimensionality reduction technique that's very slow, but it's based off a very interesting principle, the principle of kurtosis, right? So kurtosis, a lot of people called it the sort of tailedness of the distribution or the tendency of the data to present outliers. So it's a characteristic of the normal distribution. It's the fourth statistical moment. And something interesting happens when you're trying to minimize it as opposed to maximizing it, right? So when you're trying to minimize it, a bimodal distribution along one axis actually presents with lower kurtosis, right? So when you're trying to find a projection that minimizes the kurtosis, you're sort of encouraging the data to separate along an axis as opposed to sort of belong to a single distribution. You're looking for that sort of bimodality of the data, hoping to reveal some separability of the different classes, right? So I tested these three linear dimensionality reduction methods, and then I trained a support vector machine radial basis function classifier on the data, and regardless of how advanced the dimensionality reduction method was, it did not perform as well as UMAP. And that's because the problem itself is non-linear, as we sort of talked about, right? So UMAP can find more interesting projections of this nonlinear data, and it has like a 95% external accuracy, which is really, really great for such a simple model, right? Because a lot of people use this data set to train, convolutional neural networks and stuff like that. And it's just really interesting that you can use a much simpler method, a much faster method to get, results that might not be as good as a convolutional neural network, but, they're very easy to interpret, and you can get decent classification accuracy that way. And now what we're doing is we're just looking at the dimensionality reduction Jupyter Notebook for the digits data set, and it uses the scikit-learn API for both the PCA and the FastICA algorithms, and that it imports the kurtosis metric and projection pursuit analysis that are included in the GitHub repository. So I will include credit for, I think it was Steve Driscoll from Dalhousie University, that's where he did his PhD, who coded this projection pursuit algorithm, and I'll include credit where credit is due in the GitHub repository and in the description of this video, hopefully. So yes, all we're doing is we're loading the digits datasets, we're performing principal component analysis, we're training a support vector machine classifier, SVC, on the training scores, and then according to the labels for those training scores. So each of the principal components have a label associated with that, class membership, which we're using to train the model. This is a supervised learning technique. And then we're projecting the test data into the PCA. And then what we're doing is we're checking the accuracy, just using a really basic accuracy metric. And the prediction accuracy is sort of included in the title here. So you can see 65% prediction accuracy, external prediction accuracy, and the external set are the stars and the training set are the circles. Same thing with independent component analysis. We get slightly better results. Some classes are better separated than others, but I wouldn't say a significant difference in performance in terms of accuracy. Projection pursuit, my personal favorite, performs the worst, but it, and there's some settings you have to kind of specify with projection pursuit. Despite how sophisticated this algorithm is and the interesting statistical theories behind it, we get this one really, really good separated class, but it doesn't separate everything else quite as well. So that's an interesting result, but the external validation accuracy in this case isn't so good. Now, moving on to UMAP, which is some very, very basic parameters. This is just taken from the UMAP site itself, the documentation. Look at how well that clustering works. You can see that it's not always like one discrete cluster. I think these two classes are supposed to be the same, but regardless of exactly how it works, yeah, and the yellow points, it's even more obvious, right? The yellow is just sort of a little bit all over the place. But this is completely unsupervised dimensionality reduction, keep in mind, right? UMAP doesn't necessarily know where the classes are supposed to be relative to each other, but even so, it finds underlying patterns in the data that you can use to build a very, very simple classifier and test it. So That's that. That's that really, really famous example made famous by Twitter back when Twitter was cool. So yeah, feel free to take a look at this. You know, try some stuff with UMAP, try some stuff with projection pursuit analysis because there are some parameters you can modify, and feel free to let me know how it goes with any of these notebooks. If you look at day two, there are some more examples, but that's using data from a database and you should be able to figure out how that works, but I'm not going to include it as part of this video. So if you're curious, feel free to reach out to either myself if you'd like to work on some volcanology data, but for just this first day of the lecture, I just focused on general data sets that were sort of intuitive, like the mammoth data set.